times sunny Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, here on the famous Ploshcha Nezalezhnosti, so Freedom Square here, Maidan, as it is known as in Ukraine, should be Maidan Nezalezhnosti, to give its correct name. So Freedom Square, where the Euromaidan revolution was focused back in 2014, also the Orange Revolution in 2004. And I am back in Ukraine's capital, first time in a few years. In fact, I haven't had a reason with my lifestyle channel to come back here. Last time was the summer of 2023. I've been in the other cities of Ukraine that I cover, namely Odessa, Uzhhorod, Chernosy, and Lviv quite often, but this is the first time I'm back in the capital, so I will be discussing in my lifestyle channel a lot of the differences that I see from now compared to 3 years ago. On this channel, it is geopolitics and the war situations. That's what I'm going to discuss today with you. It is turning point or not in the Russo-Ukrainian war. The reason to frame it like that is Russia is coming to a point in this Russo-Ukrainian war where it may be the point of no return for their economy, and possibly, I'm feeling more probably, the actual current borders of the Russian Federation, the de jure borders, because as they go deeper and deeper towards an economic malaise, then the opportunities for parts of Russia to break away are going to increase over the next few years, and that won't become apparent immediately. A lot of the damage is done up front, and then we only see the effects several years later. So this is why I feel we are getting to watershed moment, and that watershed moment is going to be if Vladimir Putin goes for a new mobilization, which is expected at the end of September, beginning of October. I think this will be a key juncture in the Russo-Ukrainian war and for Russian society. So the situation here in Kyiv, not much has changed in terms of the control of the front lines in Ukraine. Really, that much in the last few years. It's largely turned into a war of attrition. And if you look economically, Ukraine has funds secured for the next 2 years from its European allies, whilst the economic assessment for the Russian economy is that Russia can only really continue for the next 12 to 18 months. That is not just Western analysts are saying, also Igor Girkin, who I love to quote on this channel, primarily because he's from the other side. He's a Russian ultranationalist who sits in a Russian prison, not because he's against the war in Ukraine, but because he thinks that Vladimir Putin is not prosecuting the war very well. And he is still alive, number one, at least at the time that I'm making this live stream. And number two, he also estimates that basically the Russian economy only has about another year left in it before there will be serious economic retrenchment, which means basically it will demand austerity measures, and that is not something that Russian society is, at least it's untested whether they will go along with that, especially in St. Petersburg and Moscow, which basically means they'll have to accept a huge drop in their living standards. On their side here in Ukraine, they have the funding guaranteed for another 2 years from the European Union, more or less. So on top of that, they may of course be able to get funding from their allies to extend past that. So it would seem that in a war of attrition, if not much is happening in terms of control on the battlefield, in terms of Russia being actually able to achieve a strategic objective, like, for example, taking all of the Donbass region. The current estimates are that they wouldn't even manage it in 2027. Probably not until summer approaching 2030, if we look at where they are on the battlefield at the moment and how many resources it would take to achieve that goal. That is including if they even go for a mobilization, say 500,000 Russian soldiers. Currently they're civilians that will become soldiers, as is the Ukrainian intelligence estimate for how many soldiers Vladimir Putin is considering to mobilize at the end of September, beginning of October. So even in that scenario, they still wouldn't be able to achieve that strategic objective until at least 2029. And as a result, see someone is asking me there, you can write your questions in the comment section about the 50,000, or I actually heard 20,000 North Korean troops that may come. Well, Russia will burn through that number of troops in about a month, even if it's 50,000, maybe 2 months. So that would buy them 2 months. That's not going to be a game changer in the war if it were just that number of soldiers. Now, those soldiers are alleged to being considered to be placed on the border within the Russian Federation. Maybe they would go into occupied territory, but they would not be frontline troops. So basically, it would be to free up Russian troops who are currently sitting at the border, who would then be sent, basically, to either meet their maker in the fields of Ukraine, or at least end up invalided, but they would basically be used there. And with the burn rate that Russia currently goes through its troops, that would probably buy them an extra couple of months. Again, not going to be a game changer in a war of attrition that would need for Russia to prevail to go on for probably for longer than it's since the 2022 invasion to actually be successful or achieve a strategic goal. It would definitely be several years. So that is not going to be a game changer. Of course, it buys Russia, Putin more time, but again, not going to actually change the overall trajectory of the war most likely. So whilst obviously the economy in Ukraine is to a large extent being supported by its European allies, the US doesn't support Ukraine more than some intelligence sharing, and under the Trump administration, which is obviously different from the Biden administration, and selling some weapons to Ukraine via the European allies. The European Union and Ukraine's other European allies do provide enough financial support to keep this country going, which in a war of attrition will prove to be decisive at this point, either because Russia will, under Vladimir Putin or a new leader, if that were to happen, would want a ceasefire, presumably on the current line of contact, or that Russia would actually start, their front lines would actually start to collapse and Ukraine would take back at least a large part of the currently occupied territory. So in those two scenarios, then obviously that would seem as a huge Russian loss. They would have achieved absolutely zip strategically in this war at the moment. Just to recap, they have a land bridge that they have managed to acquire. It's not just that they have a physical bridge across the Kerch Strait between Russia de jure and Crimea. They actually have a land bridge that goes around the Sea of Azov, Mariupol, Melitopol down to Crimea itself. So you could say that's a strategic achievement, a minor one considering they already had a physical bridge across before the invasion. But of course, if they were to say lose that, then it would be absolutely diddly squat to show for at that point over 5 years of a war, and that would definitely, I think, lead to a change of government in Moscow if that were to be the scenario. So as you see, the real crutch point is going to be whether Putin goes for this mobilization it's expected in late autumn. That has been, from my point of view, part of the strategy of Ukraine over the last years to actually force Russia into this scenario where they can't pay enough men to go to the front, or primarily men to go to the front and sacrifice their life in exchange for money. And that seems to have already happened in Russia, that they are losing more soldiers than they're able to recruit. So this will cause a lot of friction within Russian society, and as a result, this will weaken the central control over the Russian state and the ability to prosecute the war. From the limited kind of polling that we've seen recently in the Russian Federation, especially in light of the wild berries attacks by Ukraine, where basically they're blowing up a lot of these warehouses. Wild berries promoted itself as also helping with the war here, but for the Russian side, so helping people to supply some military material. That's what Ukraine uses as a justification, say that it's actually a military target because it's dual use. In any case, this is seen with the banning of Yabloko, which is a party in Russia, the only party, and they have been already cleared to run in what were effectively performative elections in late September for the Russian parliament, the Duma. They had a slogan that just said they wanted to have peace negotiations. It seemed that they were getting a groundwell of support. Not that they would actually win an election or something, but they would probably pass the 5% threshold and actually have elected representatives in the Duma. And then last week, they got banned on completely spurious grounds. So it shows that this is working and that Russian society probably isn't, especially Moscow superiors, probably not going to want to make the sacrifices that are necessary for Russia to actually achieve a strategic objective in this war, that they are willing to basically impoverish themselves in order to fight long enough, or at least see a big decline in their standard of living, as well as probably being forced to go out and fight, not voluntarily, at least enough of the population of the Russian Federation, this will probably lead to a change in leadership, ultimately in Russia, maybe even further decolonization, which means certain parts will break off. That's kind of the longer part, and I see this as a turning point once Putin goes for that move. I think he's going to unleash a chain of events that he will have less and less control over, and probably force him into making more and more drastic decisions. And you can make an analogy with a drunk in the casino doubling down on his bets as he loses. So, other hand, here in Ukraine, I did put the title about Donald Trump. It's more just the broader geopolitical context we've seen, obviously, as I alluded to, that under Trump administration there is extremely limited support for Ukraine, which contrasts with the Biden administration, who gave a lot of weapons and financial support, albeit with a lot of strings attached, which limited what Ukraine could do with that. But it did buy Ukraine enough time to start to create their own domestic defense industry that is becoming a world leader. Unfortunately, it is out of necessity because of this war of existential defense. And we have now seen him play a similar argument with the South Koreans and undermining the U.S. deterrence against an attack by North Korea in South Korea, by saying that basically that the U.S. shouldn't be having these joint drills with the South Koreans, and basically making all these overtures to the North Koreans at a time where North Korea is rumored to be sending troops to fight on European soil. Absolutely insane from a U.S. foreign policy point of view and the U.S. interest, but that is the broader context that we see the Trump administration work under, and it is in their national security strategy that was published, I guess, a few months ago, maybe even 9 months ago at this point, where it was all delineated there, not in the best prose, but it was there that basically they don't really seem to see themselves really allied with their official allies or their, say, post-World War II allies anymore. And that is going to cause many countries to look for alternatives and maybe to pursue their own nuclear deterrent. So in Europe, we have the United Kingdom and France have nuclear weapons. Japan and South Korea do not have nuclear weapons, example. If they don't feel that the US has got their back, are they going to go and develop those themselves? Highly probable, I would say, at this stage. So you see all this unfolding around this war that started with the Trump administration not wanting to help Ukraine, and in fact, the Russians were talking about the spirit of anchorage, whatever that was supposed to mean, after Donald Trump had invited Vladimir Putin to meet him in Alaska last year. And we see that continue in this vein of not wanting to back up the US's historical allies, and that leaving opportunities for countries like Russia to believe that they can go forward and prosecute their imperial wars of aggression, because, well, the main deterrence that was there was the US security umbrella for Europe in that case, and now it looks like for Asia as well. What are the Taiwanese thinking? That will lead to them believing that if they just keep going on long enough, then they can eventually prevail. In Putin's case, for example, I don't think that will turn out to be the case. I think at the end of the day, there's only so much that Donald Trump can do, whether he wants to see Putin win or just doesn't care. It's very hard to understand at times. But basically, he's done as much real damage to the Ukrainian cause as he could by withdrawing the financial and military support. And it doesn't seem like he's going to go any further at this juncture, probably because he doesn't have the capability in reality to do much more. So, see another question there. It's hard to read now that, hello. Okay, hello there. Keep your comments and questions coming. So there's just the one about North Korea. So that is how the Trump administration's foreign policy is playing in here. Bit of a spoiler in terms of their historical alliances with allies like Taiwan, like South Korea, although almost a fraudulent slip because of the gushing praise that at times Donald Trump has for the North Korean leadership, for Japan, and for their allies in Europe, whether they happens to be Ukraine. That's obviously not a formal alliance or a strong alliance as they have with their NATO partners, but we may find out in due course how strong that really is if the Russian Federation were to create an Article 5 situation on NATO territory, say by, I don't expect a big invasion, but say they were to have a limited incursion. I think it was the phrase the Biden administration used prior to Russia's invasion in February 22 here in Ukraine. So we'll see all that unfold in due course. So here from a personal security point of view, we are expecting a massive Russian attack on this city, Kyiv, the capital, and other parts of the country in the next 48 hours. Could have been last night, but it didn't seem like much happened last night. This also plays back into lack of support coming from the Trump administration, and even going further back to the Biden administration, when they did not dramatically increase production of air defense, in particular the Patriot missile, because they've had many years since this invasion. And obviously we've had the war in the Middle East, where the United States and its allies used up a lot of Patriot anti-ballistic missile SAM defense missile there, and now there's a big lack of them. And here in Ukraine, there's also a big lack of air defense, not as much to do with the drone threat, which they have managed to create a domestic deterrent to, or a domestic countermeasure to, with these interceptor drones. Now Russia has a new generation drones, which are harder to shoot down. They're becoming almost like a hybrid into a cruise missile. But it is for these ballistic missiles that they have very little defense currently for. They are working on their own SAM anti-ballistic missile defense. However, it's very hard to know when that would actually be in use, if they have to produce it all domestically here. There was talk of getting a license to produce the Patriot missile. Trump said yes, and he seemed to go back in a flip-flopping, as seems to be his normal behavior at this point. So probably we're going to see Ukraine actually just develop them themselves. That will not be something that can be realized effectively for 6 to 18 months. We'll just have to see how quickly they produce. Eventually they will, but for this winter, that is a very bad omen for here in cities like Kyiv, that there's very little air defense against these ballistic missiles, which are very expensive for Russia to produce and to fire, but that is what they are using. Their previous tactic, using a lot of cheaper Shahid-like drones, doesn't really work anymore, but since I think it was like last November that Ukraine had first started to use these interceptor drones, and that has actually neutralized that threat pretty much. Ukraine also now does not reveal the percentage of ordnance that is shooting down anymore. They felt that was actually giving the Russians some vital intel, so they have stopped doing that. So for now, we don't know how much they shoot down. I can tell you from where I was living in Odessa that most of the slower ground drones that come into the Odessa, they shoot nearly all of them down over the sea. It is rare that those drones get through anymore, but as I said, the ballistic missile situation is very different. So Russia still has the capacity to do a lot of damage here in Ukraine. They have ramped up the production of these ballistic missiles since the start of the war, which they only had stockpile and a capability that would have burned through them very quickly. Now they've built up the capacity to produce that. Not something that produces a return on investment, which is why for their economy it is a big drain. However, they are still with an advantage in that particular area and can wreak havoc here in Ukraine, whether it's on military targets or on civilian, which are not really targets, but civilian infrastructure in general, on the people of Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine. So that is something that is a gap in the capability that Ukraine has at the moment that they're working on a solution to, but in the meantime, it makes it very problematic from that point of view. As you see on the flip side, Ukraine continues to use these drones that Russia and Flamingo missiles, well, the Russians are doing a lot better shooting down the Flamingo missiles, but the Ukrainians are trying to figure out ways obviously to make them more effective. You see the amount of havoc that Ukraine is able to unleash on Russia by blowing up much of their oil production facility and export facility, and their ability to use systems like wild berries within the country, and that is having an impact on the support for the war, which is a key component in Russia's ability to continue to prosecute. As I've discussed, just zooming out a little bit, Vladimir Putin's number one priority is always to stay in power, and number two is to win this war and achieve a strategic objective. So by making his war less and less popular, it obviously forces him into a dilemma about what to do in order to ensure that he's going to stay in power, and that maybe often means making decisions that will make his war less likely to be successful. So that is the kind of dilemma that Ukraine has been trying to create for the last few years. Another comment here, I need to pull up my glasses. And the Ukrainians sollten sich einfach. Okay, Mark has a comment there. I actually didn't get the last part of that one. Maybe you could just rephrase it. since it automatically translates for me here on these live streams. I don't know why I need to change the settings. So Mark, let me know. Any other comments you have, any questions, drop them down below. This is the first time I've been back in Kyiv for a few years. That is basically in grosso modo what I wanted to say. This is going to be a key watershed moment in the war, really, if Vladimir Putin in about a month's time will announce, it's about 5 weeks time, will announce a new mobilization in Russia. I think at that point, it's hard to see him coming back from and staying in power in the long term. I mean, unless he actually achieves the strategic objective, then I guess he will stay in power. But I see there's a very low probability looking at the different dynamics from both sides. Not that Vladimir Putin is operating on that probably the same perspective on the information that I have. He basically believes that Ukraine will fold before the Russian Federation does. But I don't think he has any real idea about Ukrainian society in 2026. He was here, I believe, at the end maybe of the Soviet Union, maybe it was beginning when Ukraine became independent, but that was so long ago, 35 years ago. I just think that if he thinks it's like back then no wonder he's been making so many miscalculations with respect to Ukrainian resilience and resistance to Russian imperialism, because it's obviously changed dynamically, dramatically over the last 35 years. We're obviously living in a very different era, and Ukrainian nationalism and patriotism has a lot more widespread in the country than it would have been at the end of the Soviet Union. A comment from, I think, Wayne. Yeah. That is a concern if you are a civilian living in Ukraine, is that this winter is going to be even tougher than the previous winter, which was very, very cold, I have to say. Probably won't be as cold weather, but the probability that Russia is going to effectively take out things like heating and water and other essential services is even higher, because Ukraine will find it harder and harder to defend against these ballistic missiles. Whether they have enough diverse supplies for electricity and water and heating, well, I guess we'll find out, because yes, Russia has the capability to hit things that Ukraine cannot defend against, but they're very expensive. It's not like using these cheap drones en masse. And if there's just a lot of things that Russia will have to hit and blow up and destroy that can't be repaired easily, because obviously Ukraine could just make cheaper temporary solutions, then we'll see if Ukraine has a sufficient plan in place to counteract that by probably dispersing a lot of how these services are provided. It's obviously not the most effective way normally, but because you can't put everything in one place. It's a bit like with Wildberries, to give you an analogy. They have huge warehouses, whilst the Ukrainians also provide the same service, lots of service providers, but they don't have huge warehouses because Russia will blow them up. If they put everything in a 250 square meter warehouse, and Russia has a big juicy target to fire something at, and Ukraine doesn't have the air defense, well, Russia also doesn't have effective air defense, so they just have it all dispersed into smaller different depots, which means Russia has to fire an enormous amount of, they'd have to fire maybe 20 or 30 times more ordnance accurately in order to have the same impact as Ukraine flying a few relatively cheap drones into an enormous warehouse somewhere in Russia. And they've taken out more or less most of Wildberries' big depots at this stage in Russia. And I guess the Wildberries now try to make the small ones everywhere in future, but of course it'll take them a long time to do that. They're also talking about put some of it in Kazakhstan. Again, this will only be able to partially replicate what they were providing to the Russian consumers. It will of course lead to a lot of costs for Russian entrepreneurs in any case. So again, even if you figure out a countermeasure, it still weakens the domestic economy in the Russian Federation. So we are expecting a very tough winter. At least the weather is nice for now. It's going to be nice for next 2 weeks in Ukraine up until the beginning of the autumn, at least looking at the forecasts. And it is good to be back in the capital of Kyiv, in free Ukraine. You can see a little bit of Maidan Square behind me. If you're interested in coming here, of course I got my guidebook down below. You get access to my hospitality guide with my favorite cafes, restaurants, shisha lounges, clubs, bars, all that good stuff down below. You can also go and invest in a consulting call if you are planning to come here to Ukraine. I was actually with a client that I came from Chisinau to Odessa with. I will meet him in Odessa when I get back. So I do also have my in-person services, but go and check out the consulting first. It's more popular these days than the in-person experience, although I am doing one currently with a client there in Odessa. And if you want to access my knowledge 24/7, also on the consulting page, go and check out the Connor AI. I also fed in all the guidebooks, but that's a broader encyclopedic database for you to be able to troubleshoot your questions on, and you can go invest in that. It is proven to be exceptionally valuable for my clients who have invested in it. So go and check out the links in the description to this live stream. Let me see the latest comment there. Yeah, I'm not understanding one word because, unfortunately, can I turn off the translation on this? I don't understand. I need to look at the settings because I don't understand one word that comes up on Mark's comment. Are you asking me for something? Are you asking me whether Ukraine and Russia should have negotiations or something, Mark? It's hard to understand from what I can see here on my screen. Yeah, I got lost in translation there. It's just that one word at the end. This I can understand. Your comment about lost in translation. I can look it up afterwards. So, yeah, the atmosphere here in Kyiv. In short, I will discuss it when I have my next live stream on the main lifestyle channel, the main channel. I will, yeah, can you use a different word, synonym for that? Synonym? Because it's not, it keeps translating as the same word I don't understand. Probably I will only do it in about 2 or 3 weeks. But I will also relate my experience here in Kyiv. A lot has changed. So that's all to come on the next live stream on the main channel. So make sure you're subscribed, hit the notification bell for that. But the short synopsis is that it is August. So a lot of people are away, I think, at the moment. The city is a little bit emptier than I was expecting. And yeah, it's also really nostalgic for me to come back because I was here even in 2014 during the Euromaidan revolution. So I remember all the events that took place also here at the, what was that? That was the, what is the word in English? It's the building for the trade unions that was burnt down. This is the one here. Well, actually, I think I can show you this just briefly. This building here. So it has finally been restored. I think it was restored a few years ago, but it looks like it's, I went there and had coffee this morning. Actually bumped into a contact from Odessa. And yeah, there are a lot of places, new places opening up, a lot of places changing. So a good few places closed down, some new places opened up. So it definitely doesn't feel the same. If I were to do the lifestyle channel, live stream from here, I'd actually replicate the live stream I had in Odessa last summer, where I put La Fin d'Inde, like you see at the end of a film. Because yeah, if you've been to Kyiv before the invasion and you were to come back now and obviously going forward, it's going to feel radically different. And I wouldn't have said that when I was last here in 2023. I guess things started to dramatically evolve or change, probably like in Odessa from last summer, where I came to the conclusion, like if you return having not been here for 5 years, it's definitely going to feel like a different city. And probably the experience you're going to have doesn't mean it's going to be worse or necessarily better or worse than what it was, but it's definitely going to be radically different. I feel the same today in Kyiv, having walked around. I also had some meetings, hence why I'm in a suit, which I will also be in tomorrow while I'm here. Normally I'm not in a suit on these live streams, but I think a different look is also good at times. So, any final comments or questions? This was the live stream from Kyiv, but the turning point is not today, I think it's going to be this decision whether Vladimir Putin goes for a new mobilization. We are expecting it at the end of September, beginning of October. If that does take place, then I think it is crossing the Rubicon for him. Oh, you mean to unite, Mark? I don't know. That just seems weird to me. If you're saying that they should unite, I mean, that's why we have a war, because they don't want, Ukrainians don't want to be in with crappy Russia, because it doesn't offer them really that much of a future. I mean, that's what if you look at the real reason we have a war, it's starting in 2014, or even go back to 2004, when Russia tried to basically get their guy elected when he wasn't popular enough to get elected by, and the whole thing with Yushchenko being poisoned allegedly by the FSB. It's because Russia offers an inferior alternative or pathway for the future if you hang out with them than the European Union. Just look at Poland, how successful it's been, and then look at the Ukraine, which stayed in Russia's orbit in the 90s and only started trying to break out of it in the early 2000s, while Poland made a beeline to join the European Union and Euro-Atlantic institutions. So look at the difference. Like, Warsaw today is richer than Moscow. I don't think Russians actually understand that yet, that they are poor. Like, as a country, their GDP per capita is less than half of Poland's, but even Moscow Oblast is less than Poland. So, I mean, compared to Warsaw, it's rapidly. I mean, there's still some very rich parts of Moscow because it's the center of the empire and it sucks in a lot of the wealth from the rest of the country in pure imperial fashion. But yeah, that's why it's just like it's a crap alternative basically compared to joining the European Union and Euro-Atlantic institutions. It's just, look at the rapid development of Poland and other countries compared to what happens to the countries that hung out with Russia and Russia itself. In spite of all its mineral wealth, it's still a dump, most of it. So yeah, non-starter. Oh, Love Factory Sweatshop, interesting name. So he's asked me, can you go from Kosice in Slovakia to Uzhhorod or Mukachevo? Yeah, I didn't actually take that particular itinerary. I came from Budapest in Hungary when I went to Mukachevo, and also from another part of Hungary when I went to a family wedding there. It's like maybe almost 2 years ago. We were in, I always forget the name where we were, because it's quite a famous place in Hungary for wine. What is the name of it? Anyways, I've forgotten the name. I was there. It was a very nice small town, and yeah, traveled basically across the Hungarian border. So yeah, you just basically have your passport that's valid for, at least I normally say for 3 months, but technically it is for the duration of your trip to Ukraine, but just let's say 9 months, because you've 90 days visa free if you're American. If you're European, most people are don't need a visa to go to Ukraine, just need your passport and you have your visa free. So you cross the border and that's it. It's not really that complicated to come to Ukraine. It's got lost in the translation again. Well, you can write me an email. Just send me a short email and I'll see it afterwards if it was something really important. Which is the worst experience? These are the kind of things that probably you should invest in the Counter AI if you're going to have 50 questions that are like this. I see what my clients, the guys who invested in the AI, what they ask me, and all these kind of questions, like one after another. You can ask it, and 24/7 it will answer you. So that's probably more effective than asking me here for, like, it depends where you're coming from. Just go across the border at the nearest crossing. That's what I would say. Yeah, it's not so important, says Mark. Okay, all right, guys, I'm going to wrap it up unless you have any further quick questions about the geopolitical situation here in Ukraine. Just wanted to film this primarily because I'm back up in Kyiv for the first time and give you a perspective on what's going on. I guess the big development this week, or the last few days, is Donald Trump basically doing a Ukraine with South Korea, and apparently now undermining the deterrence effect also on the Korean Peninsula. So yeah, it seems to be the incoherent foreign policy by this new administration. It is definitely breaking with the past. And yeah, if we live in this kind of more transactional world where alliances don't really mean much, then we're going to see certainly nuclear proliferation, because being in an alliance with a nuclear power that's supposed to provide a nuclear deterrent that's now no longer really credible, that means you're going to have to find an alternative, either join a new alliance with a nuclear power or develop your own nuclear weapons. So I think that's almost never going to see nuclear proliferation. I would expect to see it in Europe. Countries like Poland perhaps will go now, and this country as well. To be frank, they probably also should be considering if they're not a way to gain a nuclear deterrent for the future, and we'll probably see it with Japan and the Korean Peninsula. North Korea has nuclear weapons. Why doesn't South Korea? So we're probably going to see that as a direct effect. Also, Taiwan, what are they thinking right now with China? Obviously, saying that they are legally part of China, which actually is de jure the case if you look at international law. Also, so I'm going to leave you on that note here from Kyiv in this beautiful late summer sunshine. I'm going to enjoy the next 2 evenings or so here, and the next time that we speak to each other on this channel will be from Odessa Mama on the shores of Black Sea. So, do побачення and do перемоги.